So, how strong would you say he is? Stronger than expected? The voice was calm, too calm, silken and smooth, with an undertone of sly amusement. As the NSA chairman, James, stepped into his office and loosened his tie, the speaker stood by the window, cloaked in the pale glow of the city skyline. He was tall and slender, dressed in an immaculate white suit. His face was unervingly serene, long, composed, almost mask-like. His eyes were narrow slits, more snake than man. His very presence radiated distrust. Salazar, one of the NSA's 3 S-rank superhumans. James dropped into his chair with a heavy exhale, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He didn't reply right away. Salazar tilted his head slightly, a smirk ghosting across his lips. You said it wouldn't be difficult. That with your ability, you'd put him down in seconds. Don't tell me. That kid actually managed to push you. James waved him off with a sigh. Don't be smug, Salazar. I wasn't expecting that. Salazar's smile widened, but his interest deepened. James wasn't someone who gave praise lightly. In fact, he never did. Despite being a high-tier A-rank himself, mere point from breaking into S-rank territory, James was known for overpowering his peers in straight combat. So his silence now spoke volumes. Salazar folded his arms. You think he's hiding something? James didn't answer immediately, but Salazar already had his own suspicions. He'd reviewed all the data, every video, every fight logged on Matub. Ghost, Mark Vanitas, was clearly powerful, but his past battles were inconsistent. He struggled against disaster-class threats, took damage, barely escaped at times. Yet now, he crushed a calamity class. The records didn't add up. If his ability, asterisk growing stronger with every kill asterisk, were truly that linear, his progress should have been smoother, more visible. But something was off. Very off. Salazar licked his lips thoughtfully. There's a limit, a restriction, maybe? Or he's been lying about the nature of his power. He turned back to James, awaiting confirmation. But James was staring into nothing, still lost in the echoes of the fight. Finally, he spoke. That boy will be a monster, Salazar. One way or another. Even if this raid yields nothing else, I want him to know we're allies, that we're worth trusting. Salazar blinked. For him, that was like hearing God whisper. James didn't speak in superlatives. He didn't use the word ally lightly. Salazar's tone sharpened. So, we're no longer trying to recruit him? James gave a small shrug. He won't join. You know that. Everything about him screams independence. If you press too hard, he'll push back harder. Salazar's eyes narrowed slightly. He had tried to force it. Once, sent Gray to threaten the boy. It didn't work. Mark had proven difficult. Dangerous. But Salazar wasn't a man to give up easily. In his mind, the ends always justified the means. Bribery, blackmail, intimidation, none of it was beneath him if it got results. But now James was advising restraint. James turned his head, meeting Salazar's gaze. This isn't someone you manipulate. He's still young, but he's already pushed me harder than anyone in recent years. Give it time. The more we try to corner him, the more we alienate him. But if we show strength and consistency, maybe one day he'll walk with us on his own. Then, almost as an afterthought, James added, there will never be another king. But that boy, he may come closer than anyone ever has. Salazar's expression froze for a moment. Only a flicker, but a noticeable one. His eyes darkened in contemplation. For a man like James to say that, the implications were staggering. He gave a slow nod. If you're sure, then I'll back off. For now. What neither of them knew was that James had only scratched the surface. Because Mark was king, he just didn't know it yet. Mission complete. Objective. Survive for 5 minutes against the NSA chairman. Strength plus 50. Mana plus 50. Mark exhaled as the system notification popped up. His breathing was steady, but his heart raced with adrenaline. He could feel the boost already, the surge of raw strength and the cleaner, smoother flow of mana through his veins. But his attention wasn't on that mission. His eyes locked on the one mission that hadn't disappeared. Protect and rescue Aerith. That objective was still active. It hadn't failed, which meant she was still alive. The second that mission disappeared, Mark knew she'd be dead. But until then, there was still time. And he'd make it to that island, no matter what it took. The heavy thump-thump of helicopter rotors echoed overhead, drawing every eye upward. A sleek, military-grade chopper descended toward the NSA helipad, its landing skids kicking up dust as it touched down atop the towering building. Mark stood silently on the rooftop, surrounded by Tyler, Fiona, Talia, and the old man, James, the NSA chairman. Behind them, over 50 B and A-rank superhumans were spread out across the rooftop, all gathered in preparation for the upcoming raid. Yet, even among this assembly of elites, Mark stood apart. The other superhumans kept their distance, not from disdain, but from respect. Reverence, even. Word of what happened earlier had already traveled like wildfire. Mark Venita's ghost had defeated a Calamity-class anima alone, a feat few of them could imagine, let alone replicate. Many among the crowd had already approached Mark earlier, hoping to lure him into their guilds. But they didn't get far, not with Fiona, head of the Artemis Guild, stationed protectively beside him. Her icy glare alone was enough to send most of them retreating. Those who were more stubborn found themselves inexplicably walking away, victims of her subtle blessing, which gently bent their minds to her will. No one disrespected the Artemis Guild, not unless they had a death wish. At the edge of the rooftop, two S-ranks stood apart from the others, clad in plain black combat gear. One was tall and wiry, sharp-eyed, and still as a shadow. The other was massive, nearly a mountain of man, devouring a burger like it was his final meal. Mark recognized both of them instantly. Meta, blessed by the goddess of harvest. He stored the calories he consumed as energy and converted it into raw combat power. The more he ate, the stronger he became. While Mark wasn't particularly fond of the limitation, what happens when you run out of fuel? He couldn't deny Meta's strength. Even as a low-tier S rank, Meta was a powerhouse. Archer, gifted by the god of hunting. With a conjured black bow and mana-forged arrows, he could snipe targets from miles away with inhuman precision. Together, Meta and Archer were a devastating duo, known for taking down over 5 Calamity-class threats together. Mark felt their stares, and he returned them, unflinching, calm, unbothered. Eventually, they looked away. They were curious, no doubt. But James had warned them, do not approach Mark. Not yet. And unlike others, they listened. Next to Mark, Talia stood with a pout, one hand clutching the hem of his trousers like a child claiming a new favorite toy. She was visibly annoyed, and Mark didn't need to guess why. Earlier, her grandfather had forbidden her from joining the raid. The island was unknown, the enemy uncertain, and James wasn't about to risk his granddaughter's life for a mission that wasn't fully scoped. Since then, she hadn't said a word to him, just latched on to Mark like a determined limpet. Mark still didn't know why. They'd met just hours ago, and yet she was clinging to him like they'd been inseparable for years. At first, he assumed she was afraid of heights and using him for comfort, but that theory fell apart the moment she peered over the ledge to wave mockingly at the reporters on the ground. Definitely not scared of heights, Mark thought, baffled. But she wasn't talking, wasn't whining, and wasn't in the way. So he let it be. The loud thrum of a second helicopter filled the air. Mark tapped his AirPods. Pat's smug voice greeted him immediately. Give it a few more seconds. That's yours. I had to refuel it. Was originally going to use it for a crash test, but it's good to go now. Should make it to the island and back safely. You're welcome. Mark muttered a dry thank you as the chopper came into view. It wasn't as sleek as the NSA vehicles, but it was outfitted for war. Twin cannons were mounted at its sides, and a heavy shield reinforced the nose. Mark squinted. Wait, was that for defense against anima, or for whatever crash test Pat had in mind? Either way, the fact that Pat wanted to crash a $10 million aircraft still made Mark question the man's sanity. Mark looked down at Talia. Hey, time to let go, he said gently. Go back to your grandfather and stay with him. I'll be back soon. And I'm bringing someone with me. I think you'll really like her. Talia stared up at him, cheeks puffed in protest, but eventually nodded. She released his trousers, scurried over, and hugged James' leg tightly. James knelt, smiling softly as he picked her up and whispered words of comfort. She nodded again and kissed his cheek. Her anger melted away. She understood this wasn't a time to be selfish. She just wanted them to come back safe. Mark approached the waiting helicopter and nodded at the man in the pilot's seat. You know where we're going? And what's waiting for us? The pilot met his eyes without hesitation. Your friend Pat briefed me. Said it's dangerous, but he's paying me $1 million to get you there, wait, and bring you both back. If I die, he sends the money to my family. The man smiled. That's not the kind of deal I say no to. Whatever happens, I'm in. Mark gave a small nod, impressed by the man's resolve. Then he stepped aboard. The rotor blades roared louder, and beneath the sunlit sky, the journey to the island began.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Whatever happens, I know everything will turn out all right. Mark nodded once the man said this. As far as the man understood how dangerous the situation was, then there was no need to say anything more. Mark could tell that the man was not a superhuman. He was just a regular human that Pat employed, but he was still willing to go to the island just because Pat gave him enough money. Mark has never been the sort of person to think that money was the answer to every problem, but it sure as hell fixes a lot of problems. Do you mind if I come along? I wouldn't want to be in that other ride with all the sweaty men pushing against me. You have so much space in there, so I'm sure you wouldn't mind, right? Mark turned to see Fiona walking up to him and saying this. Fiona had changed out from her long gown, and she now wore jeans and a spaghetti strap top that made her breasts look even larger than before. Fiona's alluring presence was making all the men look at her, but she didn't care, as she only had eyes for Mark right now. Mark already had a no on the tip of his tongue because he didn't feel like riding with her. She would just annoy him throughout the trip, but someone else spoke up from behind before Mark could say anything. James called Fiona back to the military-grade helicopter with an annoyed shout. Fiona, did you already forget the plan? Get back here so we can leave. We need you on the island. James shouted this, and Fiona just frowned as she thought she could leave before James saw her. The plan that they came up with was something that they needed her powers for, and if she wasn't there, then the plan would definitely fail. And since Mark's helicopter was slower than the military-grade helicopter, they would arrive on the island a few minutes before Mark, so she had to be with James and the others so the plan would work. Fiona asked Mark if he really didn't want to ride. It would be better to take a ride from them since they would arrive earlier, but Mark just shook his head and moved to board his helicopter. I'm sure they'll use that as another excuse to try and recruit me if I went with the NSA helicopter. I'll see you on the island. Fiona, try not to die over there. Fiona only smiled slightly as Mark said this, and a giddy feeling filled her heart at the realization that this wasn't just one of her minions telling her to be careful. Mark was immune to her powers, and yet he cared about her. Fiona has always been surrounded by people who loved her too much over the past 4 years. Even when she didn't have any powers, she was beautiful enough that people would still want to be close to her just for her beauty. But Mark was different. He just cared about her, and he didn't have that look that showed he wanted something more. It felt genuine coming from him. Careful there, Mark. If I didn't know any better, I would think you were in love with me already. What do you think, Why don't you call me Big Sister just this once? Potential danger has been neutralized. Mark glared at Fiona as he noticed that she tried using her power on him once again, and Fiona just giggled and turned with a wave. Sorry. I thought I'd see if my charm would make you let me in. Don't look at me like that. It hurts. I won't do it again, little brother. I promised. Fiona felt that giddy sensation in her heart again as her skill failed to work on Mark, and she didn't understand what it was. Why was she getting happy that her skill was not working on Mark? She should be angry that she couldn't trap him in her ability, but for some reason, she couldn't stop smiling. Mark just scoffed before smiling at her antics. Mark was glad that she was still able to joke like this because that meant she didn't feel any nervousness. Mark just hoped she would be fine on the island since no one really knew how dangerous that place would be. Mark spoke to the driver and told him to get going, and the helicopter took off from the building and started to make its way to the island. Fiona went over to the military helicopter when she saw that everyone else had already boarded, and they also took off as the helicopter released intense wind pressure and maneuvered towards the island. On the island, Aerith was sitting against the wall in the underground tunnel. Her eyes were bloodshot because she had been crying since she came here, but she was no longer crying because she was too tired to continue. Her clothes were no longer wet, and she was glad, but she still felt feverish. Her head was muddy, and she could feel that her face was hot, so she was sure that she had a fever. Aerith looked around the underground tunnel with some curiosity in her eyes as she wondered where in the world she was. She remembered how the fish-headed anima took her from the school and brought her over the sea, but she passed out halfway through the journey, and she didn't remember what direction she went in. If she knew the direction, then she could have used that to tell where she was since she was good at geography. Aerith glared up at the many animas walking down the tunnel, and she only had one thought in her head. Why were none of the anima hurting her? Aerith had been here for more than 4 hours, but in all that time, there hasn't been a single incident where an anima tried to hurt her or even came close to her. Aerith was so shocked by this that she didn't even look terrified anymore, and she was only staring at all the passing anima curiously, as none of them even bothered to give her a second glance. The way they move and the things that they were carrying in the cave reminded Aerith of what an ant colony looked like. It felt like she was watching worked ants carrying food inside for their queen. Aerith didn't know it, but she was right. This entire island was a colony that sprang up 2 years ago when an ant anima began to cultivate his queen. He recruited many anima and trained all of them to bring food for his queen, and he was using them as the worker ants in his colony. 2 years ago, something like this would not have been possible, but just like humans evolve, the anima were also evolving, and rather than just fighting mindlessly, they were now capable of thought, and they could do more than just killing. Screech. Aerith felt her blood run cold as a screech rang out through the entire tunnel, and she saw all the anima moving through the tunnel stop in their tracks immediately. Enhance. Aerith scooted back and pressed her back against the wall in fear as she thought that there was something wrong. All the anima that were walking turned around and began to run out of the tunnel, but one of them didn't run away. Instead, it walked up to her and began to reach down for her. No, no, leave me alone, leave me alone. Aerith screamed at the top of her lungs as the anima grabbed her by her hand and began to pull her into the inner tunnel without caring about what she was screaming. Aerith was taken through a lot of tunnels before she was finally dragged into an inner chamber that looked like a giant cave. There was a giant pod lying in the middle of the room, and Aerith could see that there was something moving inside that pod. It didn't have a specific shape, but it shifted and churned around like it was solid matter, and Aerith felt sick to her stomach as she saw it. But that mass inside the pod wasn't the most dangerous thing here. Instead, Aerith couldn't take her eyes off the humanoid-looking ant that was standing in front of the pod and petting it. The anima was caressing the pod lovingly as it looked at the moving mass within the pod. Yes, yes, you're going to be very useful in luring the boy king here. Very useful indeed. Like fresh bait on a hook, you will lure the fish towards us. Exclamation point. Aerith almost had a heart attack right there as she heard the anima talking to her, and she took a step back in shock. The anima that was holding onto her hand dragged her forward, and she was forced down to her knees as he threw her to the ground. Aerith wanted to say anything at all, but she couldn't even talk as a massive pressure slammed down on her and made her begin sweating from the intensity. Aerith has never felt as powerless as she did at that moment. She felt like she was just a bug, and the anima in front of her was a human that was about to step on her. But even though she was terrified, she still tried to keep her head calm as she looked up at the ant-headed anima that was walking closer to her. The anima grabbed Aerith's face and turned her head from side to side as if he were inspecting her quality. Good quality. Very good. This will not be a bad appearance for my queen to take. Now you must serve your purpose. Take her to the chamber and prepare her for the rebirth. The queen will soon be born. The ant-headed anima said this, and Aerith immediately understood what he was trying to do to her. He was trying to birth a new queen for the colony, and he was going to use her as food for the queen so that the queen could take on Eret's appearance. Eret suddenly felt a jolt of fear pass through her as she imagined being used as food for something like that. She would be killed here, and there was no one that could help her. What was she going to do? She couldn't fight back, and she couldn't even call for help since she didn't have any way to communicate with the outside world. Was she really going to die in this place like a chicken? And what was that thing that he was talking about? He was trying to lure a boy here? The only boy that Eret could think of at that moment was Mark, and she immediately knew that Mark was the one that they were trying to lure. They wanted to use her as bait to lure Mark into this place. Eret also noticed how they called Mark King, but she didn't pay that any mind as she shouted at the anima in anger. "You bastards! You can understand me, can't you? I promise you won't get away with this. Do you think Mark will let you get away with doing something like this? You want to lure him here? Do you know who he is? He's a superhuman. Just let him come and get you. He'll tear you apart like the ant that you are. Just you wait." Eret knew that it would be useless to beg the anima. They were creatures that enjoyed killing humans, and it would be foolish for her to think that the anima would start listening to her just because she begged them to. So, instead, Eret resorted to the only emotion that was left inside of her, and that was anger. She was angry at everything and everyone, and she just shouted at the top of her lungs. She didn't care anymore if she died or if she was saved. She just wanted to hurt something. Just die. Die, you idiot. Die. The anima was stunned as he watched Eret shouting at him at the top of her lungs, and a creepy smile slowly spread across its face. Eret recoiled in disgust from the look that he gave her, and she had to look away just to get that look out of her sight. Seeing an ant smile has to be the most terrifying thing that she has ever seen. The anima was happy because of how feisty Eret was. This one would definitely be a good addition to the queen. The queen would come out with a strong, feisty personality once she feeds on this one. And once the queen gets the power from that boy, then there is nothing that can stop them anymore. They would bring forth a new Armageddon and take over this world before anyone could stop them. Take her to the chamber and prepare her. This one is good meat. The ant-headed anima said this to the fish-headed anima that brought Eret to the cave, and the fish-headed anima nodded and grabbed Eret by the arm once more. "Let go of me, you bastard. I said let go. Mark will kill all of you. He'll kill you." Eret was relentless in her anger, but she couldn't do anything as the fish-headed anima dragged her to the chamber and threw her against the wall of the room. Bam! Eret's back slammed against the wall, and she groaned in pain as she saw the anima opening what looked like a pod. It grabbed her and tossed her inside the pod. And even though Eret fought with all her strength, there was nothing she could do as she was trapped inside the pod, and it slowly began to fill up with a strange liquid. Goop! Goop! Hey! Stop this! What the hell is this? It's going to kill me. Let me out. Please, let me out. Slam! 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 Eret slammed her hand against the pod over and over again, but no matter how much she hit it, there was nothing she could do as the strange liquid filled the tank and completely engulfed her. It only took a few seconds before Eret could no longer move, and her body went still in the pod. "Go and bring me the king. I don't care if you kill him or not. We do not need his consciousness. We only need his blessing to make the queen stronger. Bring him to me, even if it costs you your life." The ant-headed anima said this loudly, and every single anima in the tunnels could hear him as they all began to charge out from the tunnels. "Yes, my lord." Another ant-headed anima was standing at the side of the cave, and it bowed respectfully to the leader as it left to do as it was ordered. The anima leader was trying to use Mark to awaken his queen, and he wanted to feed Mark to his queen and give Mark's power to the queen. For years ago, every anima in the world felt the power of king. They all knew how oppressive and invincible that power was, and it placed the fear of the unknown in them. Even after the power disappeared, they still knew that king was a danger to them all. But that power disappeared for a long time after the fight against the anima, and they all wondered when they would feel that power rise again. But after the system woke up again, the anima were shocked as they felt the power of king for the second time. This time, the power they felt was not as strong as the previous one that took down the Armageddon. But none of them could deny that this power was from King. The ant-headed anima, nurturing his queen, realized that since King was weaker now, he could prey on him and use his power to make his queen more powerful. That's why he sent the anima to attack Mark once they noticed that his system was awake. They wanted Mark's blessing so that when the queen woke up, she would have King's power and would be stronger. Even though the anima didn't know exactly what Mark's power was, they were confident enough that once they had it, their queen would be the strongest anima in existence. The island off the coast of America was filled with the sound of helicopters landing on the shores. The two military helicopters landed, and the superhumans began to descend from them and prepare their weapons and powers as they looked into the dense forest in front of them. They all knew that this would be a dangerous mission, and they all could die if they weren't careful. So the B ranks were going to be grouping themselves in groups of 5 or more, and the A ranks would pair up. There were 2 S ranks on the team, and both of them would be allowed to do whatever they wanted since they were strong enough to handle it. Fiona, James, Tyler, and the 2 S ranks took the front as they would lead the other superhumans in a battle. Fiona looked high into the sky, and she saw a hill on the horizon that looked like a good place to carry out the plan. Fiona was going to be acting as the bait in this mission. From what they had seen on the map before, there were too many heat signatures on this island, and it would be bad if they allowed the anima to attack them all at once. So they were going to draw the anima into the forest using Fiona's blessing and then allow the S and B ranks to attack the anima from behind. When Fiona is using her blessing, the anima will remain drawn to her no matter what. So even if the other superhumans are attacking from behind, the anima would not attack them in full force. At most, there will only be 1 or 2 monsters that attack at one time, and that would allow the other superhumans to gang up on them. From what the research team told them, the anima on this island was going to be mainly disaster class, but they also knew that a single disaster class could cause a lot of damage if it wasn't taken care of by at least 5 B ranks at the same time. Rumble, 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 rumble. The ground under their feet began to shake, and the superhumans all knew that this was a result of the monsters charging for them. Fiona called on Tyler once she felt the tremor, and she told him to take them towards the hill in the distance. That would be a good place to start the attack, since it was open on all sides, and the anima wouldn't have a chance to attack them from the forest. Tyler was more physically strong than Fiona, so he would be able to move much faster than her. He came and grabbed her before shooting into the forest at an insane speed. Fiona activated her power, and the entire force of anima that were attacking seemed to shift as the blessing drew them towards her and Tyler. Back at the beach, James gave out orders to the other people that were remaining. He told Archer to go and help Fiona. It would be good to have at least 1 S rank with them so he could get the other monsters off their back in case they get overwhelmed. And since Archer was good at fighting from a distance, he would be able to get rid of any monster that was trying to sneak up on Tyler or Fiona. Archer nodded, and he gave a nod to Meta before he dashed away to go and meet up with Tyler and Fiona. James then separated the remaining hunters into 2. 70% of them were going to go and fight against the monsters that were being drawn by Fiona, and the remaining 30% were coming with him underground. James didn't know what the monsters were doing on this island. Even though they had done a lot of research into this island and the strange activities from the anima, they didn't know anything about what they were really doing down there. The only thing that they knew was that the anima would occasionally take fish and human meat into the underground tunnel. James didn't know if they were storing it or if they were using it to feed something else, but he needed to find out. The reason why Fiona was drawing so many monsters away was so that she would give him an opening to go and find out what the monsters were doing underground. James told the remaining 30% of the monsters that they would be with him, and they were going underground to go and see what the monsters were doing there. Does everybody have their recorders in place? Turn them on and begin transmission. The research team gave every member of the attack team a recorder that they attached to their chest to send back videos of what was happening here to the research team. The research team planned to use the recordings to understand what the anima were doing on this island. But James also knew that they were doing it in case everyone on the subjugation team died, and they were unable to bring back anything. The research team would still have the recording either way. It was a cold act that seemed heartless, But that was just how dangerous this world was. They had to be ready for any scenario that could occur on the island, including the possible death of every person there. What about that Mark boy? Are we going in without him? I thought you made him join, so he can help us out in the underground tunnels. Meta was the one who asked this question with a frown on his face, as his eyes caught a glimpse of Mark's helicopter coming from a distance. Meta didn't know why Mark refused to join them in using the military helicopter, but Meta could already tell that the S ranks were on bad terms with Mark. He didn't like people who didn't understand how important it was to work on a team. Meta thought that Mark was only acting this way because he defeated a calamity class, and he would eventually calm down again when he sees how dangerous this world really is. Even though Meta could see the helicopter easily, that was only because of his superior senses as a superhuman. The helicopter was still very far away, and it would take about 2 minutes for it to get to the island. James could also see the helicopter, and he thought about what Meta said. James knew that Mark was only here to get Aerith, and if James asked him to join them, then Mark could be impatient, and he would charge into the tunnels without thinking because Aerith might be in there. James would rather deal with this with only the people that he has here. He was already going to do this mission with only these people after all, and Mark was just a last-minute addition that didn't make much of a difference. It would be fine if they went alone. We are going in alone. Mark can join Fiona and Tyler when he gets here and help them to cut down the number of anima attacking. There won't be much of a difference since we were already planning to do this without him. James said this, and he started making his way toward the forest and the hole that the research team pointed out on the map for him. James was confident in his strength and the strength of Meta, who was an S rank. He was sure that they would be able to handle anything they saw down there on their own. James had no idea that they were walking into hell itself. They thought that they could go down there to kill any anima they saw before it could come out. But the anima down there were already waiting for them, and this would not go as they planned at all. The anima were now acting in teams, and they had a leader, just like the humans, which allowed them to make complex plans. The superhumans thought that most of the anima came out from the tunnels to attack them, but they would be caught unawares once they enter the tunnel and see that the most powerful anima was waiting for them. Mark looked out from the side of the helicopter, and he hummed and narrowed his eyes as he saw a large mass of anima migrating toward a certain point on the island. There must be about 50 of them down there. There are so many. Mark has only seen this many anima once before, and that was when he was fighting against the Armageddon. There were hundreds of low-level anima helping the Armageddon, and Mark had also fight them off before he could get to the Armageddon. That was the only time when anima worked together, and Mark knew that they were only following the Armageddon because of how strong it was. Mark shook his head and decided that it wasn't important to think about the number. From what Mark learned from the research team, they said that there were some tunnels underground that they used as their hiding place and nest. Mark was sure that they would take Aerith into their nest, so Mark only needed to find those tunnels so that he could find where they took Aerith. Mark could have gone to help the other superhumans who were struggling against the monsters, but Mark didn't have the time for that. Mark was only going to find Aerith, and he would get her to safety as quickly as possible. When he sends her away, then he could turn around and help the other superhumans if they needed it. Back on the island, Fiona could tell that there was something that changed in the anima as she used more and more of her blessing to draw them in. Tyler was still carrying her, and they were making their way towards the hill where they planned to fight, but the anima that she was pulling towards them were no longer following her mindlessly. The anima started to break out from her control slowly, and Fiona didn't know what was causing it. Fiona felt that some of them were still following her, but there were many others who were no longer following her, and they were turning around. This was bad. Many superhumans behind her weren't strong enough to deal with the monsters. If the monsters attacked them without warning, then the number of casualties would be insane. The superhumans were all depending on the fact that Fiona could draw in all the monsters, so none of them would expect to suddenly see monsters attacking them. Fiona realized that she would have to just start the fight here before the monsters managed to attack the other superhumans. She shouted to Tyler that he needed to drop her and help the other superhumans, and Tyler didn't waste any time as he immediately threw Fiona forward and turned around. A massive, swirling inferno appeared around Tyler as he prepared his blessing, and he turned to Archer, who was sitting in a tree far away and waiting for Tyler's signal to begin the fight. Tyler nodded to Archer, and Archer cocked his bow and created a mana arrow before sending it at the monsters. Whoosh! Archer's arrows were special because they weren't meant for just piercing the enemy. Archer could place one of 3 different properties into each of his bows. He could either make his bow explode, or he could make his bow extremely heavy to pierce through strong armor. He could also create a whirlwind around his bow to create a distraction or disorient the enemy. These 3 properties were enough for Archer to deal with any anima that he meets. Archer had killed hundreds of anima before, and he was sure that this mission would be just as easy as the others. Boom, boom, boom. Archer sent 10 arrows in quick succession and destroyed 5 disaster-class anima that were heading toward Tyler with explosive arrows. He watched as Tyler charged straight for the anima and slammed through their ranks. Tyler created a column of fire that incinerated an anima before he used that same fire to cut down a tree and allowed it to crush another anima on the ground. Tyler left the anima, and Archer cocked his bow back and killed the crushed anima with a simple arrow to the head. Squelch! Archer breathed out a sigh of relief, and he prepared another arrow. You are too much trouble to be left alive. I will deal with you first! Exclamation point. You are too much trouble to be left alive. I will deal with you first! Exclamation point. Archer's entire body shivered as a voice suddenly whispered in his ear. There was an intense oppressiveness that almost made him wet himself from that voice. Archer was a hunter, and he was used to staying in one place for a long time. That meant that he was very good at noticing changes in his environment. Even the slightest movement from a rat would catch Archer's attention, but he was not able to tell when this thing came up from behind him. He didn't even notice anything until the person spoke. Archer immediately jumped off the tree and turned around to fire an arrow at the person, but he was stunned as he saw what was behind him. It didn't make any sense at all. Wasn't that an anima? Then how to talk? That short moment of distraction was enough for Archer to let his guard down, as he was too shocked to fire his arrow, and the anima stretched out its hand and grabbed Archer by the face. The anima was the same one that the leader instructed to bring Mark to him. Once the leader told it to come and deal with Mark, it made its way to the surface and went to the place with the most fighting because it thought that Mark would be there. But when it got here, it realized that it made a mistake. Then, the anima felt Mark's power on the other side of the forest, and it was about to make all of the other anima turn around and go towards where they could feel Mark's power. But it was difficult for the anima to control the other lower-ranked anima, because there was someone here who was also controlling them. Fiona's blessing was interfering with his command channel, and some of the anima were not listening to the higher-ranked anima's orders. They were being lured in by Fiona, so they were ignoring every other order that told the high-ranked anima that these superhumans would have to be dealt with first before they could go and find the boy. So it sent the lower-ranked anima ahead of it first, and it turned around to deal with the superhumans. It decided that it would be best to deal with the most dangerous one first. And after watching for a few seconds, it decided that Archer had to be the most dangerous out of them. Swish! Archer suddenly released another arrow, and the anima tilted its head to the other side and allowed the arrow to fly past it. Boom! But the anima didn't expect the arrow to suddenly explode once it flew past its head, and it took a step forward in surprise as shockwave hit it from behind. But its hand was still holding on to Archer's face tight, and Archer was starting to grow afraid as he realized that the anima was not going to let go no matter what. Bang! 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 Let go! Archer started to slam his hand into the anima's forearm to make it let go. Archer might be a long-distance fighter, but he was still an S rank with enough strength to destroy a building with ease. He could use a single blow to send a skyscraper into the ground. But there was no reaction at all from the anima that was holding him. It looked like the anima couldn't even feel the punches at all. The anima's arms started to tighten, and Archer screamed in pain as he felt his skull getting crushed. He grabbed the anima's arm and started to kick its body using his legs, But the anima still didn't budge, and it just continued to squeeze tighter and tighter until... Crack! Squelch! The sound of Archer's skull popping like a balloon echoed through the area, and the anima dropped his body to the ground and looked down at its blood-stained hand. It licked the blood off its hand, and a sadistic smile crept onto its face as it saw Fiona staring right at it. Hello, superhuman. Fiona was very far away from the anima, but she knew that distance was nothing for beings with as much power as them. That anima could cover the distance in no time at all. She stepped back in fear as she wondered what the hell that thing was. It just killed Archer like Archer was a bug under its feet. There was nothing she could do if that thing decided to attack her head-on. She had to get to Tyler and warn him about it. You plan to run? Exclamation point. A voice suddenly came from behind Fiona, and she froze like a deer in the middle of the road. She glanced up to where she had seen the anima before, and she was stunned when she didn't see it there anymore. It was able to move from all the way over here to behind her in just a split second. How fast is this thing? Fiona was not the physically strongest, but that did not mean that she couldn't follow attacks with her eyes easily. Her senses are still better than any human could hope to be, but she didn't even notice the anima move before it was already behind her. A cold sweat came down the side of her face as she felt that she was going to die at that moment. She was well and truly screwed. Her blessing was still active, but the anima was not even reacting to it. That could only mean that the anima was so strong that her blessing had no effects on it at all. Or was it because of its advanced intelligence? Anima were usually mindless creatures, and she could control them easily. So for this anima to be talking, that must mean that it was far more intelligent and its mind was stronger than other anima. Duck! Fiona suddenly heard a loud voice echo through the forest, and she didn't need to be told twice as she quickly fell to the ground as Tyler appeared from inside the forest with a flaming fist. Rargat! Kaboom! He sent a punch straight at the anima to push it back. He then created a wave of fire and slammed it into the anima's side and made it fly away from them. Foom! Mark jumped off the helicopter and landed on the beach as he looked around him. He signaled to the helicopter with his hand, and the helicopter slowly turned and began to fly away. The pilot would find a safe place to land, and then he would come back here to pick Mark up once Mark calls him. There was no way the helicopter could stay here when they knew there were many monsters around. There was a large forest in front of Mark, and Mark knew that he would have to go in there if he wanted to find an entrance into the tunnel. Kaboom! Suddenly, a large explosion made the ground under Mark's feet tremble, and he saw a column of fire rise into the sky from deep in the forest. Mark could tell that the superhumans were fighting against the anima, but he didn't know who that was. He would have gone to check, but he was more interested in finding Eret. Nothing else was important right now. Mark landed in this area because he was sure that anima would be preoccupied by the other superhuman and he could go to the underground tunnel without trouble. Mark watched the helicopter leave before he turned back to the forest. He narrowed his eyes at the forest as he started to think about how he would go from here. But he frowned as he felt something under his feet. Rumble, rumble, rumble. A tremor? No, an attack from underground. Boom! Mark jumped into the air as the ground under his feet suddenly burst open, and a large anima jumped out and tried to take a bite from his feet. Mark saw the forest shaking, and he was shocked when almost 50 anima shot out from within the forest and began to charge straight for him. New mission alert. Survive the anima horde. New mission alert. Survive the anima horde. The anima horde has killed 80% of the superhumans that came to this island. Survive the horde and make your way down into the underground tunnels. Horde composition. 20 low-level disaster class, 0/20. 10 high-level disaster class, 0 out of 10. 5 low-level calamity class, 0/5. 1 high-level calamity class, 0 out of 1. Rewards. Plus 15 stat points per low-level disaster class. Plus 20 stat points per high-level disaster class. Plus 100 skill points per low-level calamity class. Plus 100 skill points and plus 100 stat points per high-level calamity class. Hidden rewards. Failure. The user will die. Eret will die. The user is fighting against a monster that is at least one rank above him. The title, He Who Perseveres Through Hell, plus 10% increase to all stats, will be activated. Mark was stunned once he saw the system message. 80% of the superhumans were already dead. It hasn't even been 5 minutes since they landed. How could they already be dead? Mark knew that they did a lot of research into the monsters here, and they even made a plan about how to attack the monsters to prevent too many casualties. So, how in the world were most of them already dead? Doesn't that mean that all the research they did was meaningless since the monsters were far stronger than they anticipated? Mark didn't want to be the sort of person who says, "I told you so," but he definitely told them that something like this was a possibility. Run. Run away from there. The monsters have gone mad. They're coming. Run. Squelch. Wait. Don't leave me behind. Wait. Roar. Some superhumans were running out from inside the forest as the monsters charged through the trees while heading toward Mark. The superhumans had been following the plan, but they didn't expect the sudden change in the monsters' movement, and they were caught completely unaware as the monsters turned around and began to attack them instead of following after Fiona. The anima had already killed a lot of the superhumans, and the remaining superhumans were mainly ranks who were able to use their skills to barely hold the monsters back. They killed some of the low-level disaster classes, but there was nothing they could do against the high-level disaster classes and the other low-level calamity classes that were chasing them. They could only run and hope to reach the helicopter to escape. Mark leapt over the anima that attacked him from underground. He grabbed it by its arms and slammed his heel into its stomach. Mark then pulled the arms until he detached them from its body, and the anima stopped moving. Mark had grown much stronger since he fought against that calamity class, so the low-level and medium-level disaster class monsters were not even a challenge to him. The only thing that would prove a challenge was the low-level and high-level calamity classes. Mark ducked under a monster that tried to skewer him. He grabbed the monster by the arm and ripped its arm away from its body before using the arm to slap the monster into the ground and crush it under his feet. Squelch. User has killed 2 low-level disaster class, plus 30 stat points. Mark glanced at all the monsters around him as he threw the arm aside. Mark counted 20 low-level disaster class anima. In 5 high-level disaster class, there were 5 monsters still attacking the superhuman to the side, and Mark guessed that those were the remaining 5 high-level disaster classes. But where was the high-level calamity class? Mark would immediately be able to sense if that calamity class was here, but Mark could not sense it at all. Was it in another part of the forest? Mark had to kill that calamity class as well if he was going to complete this mission. The system was giving some very good rewards for killing the monsters, and Mark could no longer see monsters in front of him. All he saw were stat points that would help him grow stronger. The system also said that there were hidden rewards, and Mark felt his motivation double, as he wanted to get those rewards no matter what. Mark didn't even wait for the monsters to attack him. He charged straight for them. The monsters were stunned for a moment as they saw the human attack, but they didn't stay shocked for long as they also charged. Mark caught the fastest anima by the neck and used that one as a battering ram as he charged straight through the anima that were trying to surround him. The best strategy for dealing with these monsters was to not fight them in the open. Mark needed to draw them toward the forest so that he could use the trees as a means to slow them down and give him more time to deal with them one-on-one. Mark would be overwhelmed if he fought against the monsters together, but when they were on their own, they didn't stand a chance. Whoosh! A monkey-based anima suddenly charged at Mark faster than the others and dragged him deeper into the forest by force. The anima was a low-level calamity class, so it had a lot more power than the others. Mark grabbed the monkey's tail and threw it off him, but the monkey only flipped around and latched onto a tree. Oh! Many other monkey-based anima joined the monkey anima as they all surrounded Mark. Mark could tell that the other monkeys were only low-level and high-level disaster classes, unlike the low-level calamity class. The monkeys shouted a battle cry as they charged for Mark, and Mark used one of the trees as a barricade to block them from swarming him. But the monkey was able to easily break through the tree with its punch, and Mark had to cross his arms to block the hit. Slam! The anima grabbed Mark and wanted to throw him back, but Mark sent mana to his legs as he grabbed the monster by its arm and spun himself around to deliver an axe kick that caved the monster's head in. The monster was only a low-level disaster class, so the kick was enough to tear a hole through its head and send it to the afterlife. Roar! Mark dodged many other attacks from the anima. He was using the trees expertly to jump around the forest as he dodged, but Mark was still cautious because of the low-level Calamity-class monkey that was right on his tail. The Calamity-class monkey was not attacking, and it looked like it was waiting for the right moment for Mark to let down his guard so that it would attack. Mark stopped running and charged for one of the high-level disaster-class anima in front of him, and he sent a punch straight through the anima's stomach. Critical hit. Boom! The anima was unable to withstand the full force of the strike, and it was obliterated along with a long line of trees in the forest. Whoosh! The punch literally carved a path through the forest and gave Mark some room, as the other monsters were immediately cautious of attacking. Mark ran for the next monster immediately, and he sent a massive amount of power to his knee as he grabbed the monster by its head and brought his knee up to strike the monster in the face. Slam! The monster's face caved in, and Mark grinned as he felt the bone in the monster's face break under the force of his kick. User has killed 2 low-level disaster class, plus 30 stat points. User has killed 1 high-level disaster class, plus 20 stat points. User has killed 2 low-level disaster class, plus 30 stat points. User has killed 1 high-level disaster class, plus 20 stat points. Mark landed on the ground, and he cleaned the blood that spread on his face as he looked around at all the monsters in the area. They were still charging for him, so he would not have time to rest yet. Mark glanced at his system tab at the side, and he saw that he now had 100 stat points to work with. Since Mark was going to be fighting against a lot of monsters right now, he needed to improve both his agility and durability so he could move around however he wished. He was already very agile, and he could tell that his strength and stamina were not lacking since he was barely tired after that altercation. Vanitas, we need to move the other superhumans out from here. Most of us are dead, and the rest can't fight anymore. There's a helicopter on the far side of the beach. If we move over there, we can use it to escape. One of the remaining ranks shouted out to Mark for him to retreat, but Mark just ignored the man as he continued changing his stats. The man shouted at Mark again and tried to get his attention. The man knew that it was only a matter of time before the monsters killed all of them. The plan was already messed up, and they needed to get out before they all died. Mark was not having any of that. They wanted him to abandon Eret and leave? Was this man insane? Mark was going to charge forward until he finds Eret. He didn't care what they did. If you want to leave, then leave. I didn't come here with the NSA. I came here alone, so I will fight alone as well if I need to. Don't try to drag me down with the rest of you. Mark finally finished sending his extra stat points to the stats he wanted them to be, and a new prompt came up. Does a user wish to add stat points to the selected stats? Yes/no. Mark chose yes, and he felt his body becoming lighter and tougher as the system moved the stat points. User has added 40 points to agility. User has added 40 points to durability. Agility, 600 plus 60. Durability, 460 plus 46. Mark grinned as he raised his clenched fist to eye level. He couldn't believe how much power he could get from just killing monsters. Mark knew that he lied to the NSA about his power. He didn't tell them that he had a system for his own reasons, but that did not mean that what he told them was completely wrong either. Mark was now sure that the more he killed, the stronger he could become. Come at me, you fucking EXP. Roar. Boom. A massive explosion of power echoed across the entire forest as Mark jumped into the fray with the monsters, and they went at it like wild animals. Blood flew like a river, and the entire landscape was reshaped through the force of the raw power that Mark and the anima were releasing while fighting. User has killed 3 high-level disaster class plus 60 stat points. User has killed 10 low-level disaster class plus 150 stat points. Mark was in the middle of smashing a monkey's head in when he heard a woman shout from beside him. Mark slammed his fist into the face of the monkey in front of him and watched the monkey fly away. He then turned to see what was happening, and he saw that a large congregation of monkeys were chasing after two superhumans. The monkeys realized that Mark was harder to deal with than the other superhumans, and they decided that they would go after the easier prey. Mark charged off from where he was standing and dashed towards where the monkeys were congregating. Boom! Mark slammed his foot into the head of one of the monkeys, and it exploded in a shower of gore that made all the other monkeys in the area recoil in shock. Mark grabbed the monkey beside him by its tail, just as it was about to run away, and he used it to slam another monkey into a tree, and they both crumpled into paste as they were destroyed. User has killed 4 low-level disaster class plus 60 stat points. Mark was about to charge into battle again, but he stopped as he heard a branch crack from behind him. Mark immediately dodged to the side as the tree beside him was obliterated by a large rock. Boom! Mark rushed to his feet, and he saw that it was that same monkey anima from before that was attacking him. Mark narrowed his eyes at the monster, and he could have sworn that he saw that monkey smile at him as it picked up another large rock from the side and prepared to throw it at Mark. Whoosh! Mark moved out of the way just as the rock was about to hit him, and he caught a low-level disaster class that tried to attack him from the side while he was distracted. Mark tisted the monkey's neck with both hands, and a loud crack echoed through the forest as Mark snapped its neck. Crack! User has killed 1 high-level disaster class plus 20 stat points. The monkey that was throwing the rocks was one of the low-level calamity class monsters, and Mark could see that it was far more intelligent than the other monsters since it wasn't just charging in like the other stupider monsters. It was taking its time and staying far from Mark while throwing rocks to distract Mark so that the other monsters would have a chance to attack him. The monkey was probably on the same level of strength as the ant-headed anima that Mark fought in City A. It would not be difficult to deal with this calamity class if it was alone, but it would be more troublesome if the other monsters in the forest kept attacking whenever Mark was distracted. Oh, AHH, AHH. The anima suddenly shouted out to the other monsters in the forest as it told them to not give Mark any room to breathe. Mark saw all the monsters charge him, and he decided he needed to get some space between them. He turned and grabbed the 2 superhumans that were being attacked before dashing off with the 2 humans under his arms. He needed to lose the monsters so he could come up with a plan. He wouldn't be able to fight the calamity class if all the smaller disaster classes were constantly attacking him. So the best thing he can do now is to draw them into a chase that would allow him to deal with them in different one-on-one situations. That way, he could kill the disaster classes before having to worry about the calamity class. To the helicopter! Take us to the helicopter. We need to get out of here right now. There are too many of them. The female superhuman started to shout out orders at Mark as she pointed in the direction where the helicopter was, and she was stunned when she noticed that Mark was not even going in that direction. He was moving deeper into the forest away from the helicopter. Was he really going to try fighting all those monsters on his own? There were too many of them. What the hell are you doing? What the hell are you doing? The woman felt a great surge of fear fill her heart as Mark turned around and tossed her and the other superhuman to the ground. Mark made sure that they had lost the monsters that were trailing them, and then he spoke to the 2 superhumans. We've come far enough, so it should be easier for you to get out to the helicopter. I'll create a diversion and make the monsters follow me, and the both of you get out of here. I can't fight if you're ranting in my ear all through. The woman immediately felt insulated as she heard him say this, and she immediately started to reprimand him. Don't talk to your elders like that. You're just a kid. Will you shut up, woman? Just shut up. Look, Vanitas, you should also think about getting out of here. There are too many monsters up here, and we don't know how many more there are down in the tunnels. It's too dangerous to try fighting all of them. The other person that Mark saved immediately shouted after shutting the woman up, and the woman blushed in anger as Mark nodded to the man while tweaking his system. There were many more stat points in his system, and Mark was going to use them to improve all of his stats right now. And there was also one skill that Mark needed to improve as quickly as possible. Does the user wish to add stat points to the selected stats? Yes/no. Mark chose yes, and he felt the changes in his body as the stats were improved. User has added plus 70 points to strength. User has added plus 50 points to stamina. User has added plus 50 points to agility. User has added plus 50 points to durability. User has added plus 90 points to mana. Stat improvement due to application of mana. Strength plus 6%. Stamina plus 6%. Agility plus 2%. Superhuman system. Name, Mark Vanitas. Race, human. Title, He Who Perseveres Through Hell. Plus 10% increase to all stats. Rank, A2120/3000. Affiliation, True Good. Unused stat points, 0. Unused skill points, 50. Strength, 820 plus 82 plus 80. Stamina, 650 plus 65 plus 58. Agility, 650 plus 65 plus 13. Durability, 510 plus 51. Mana, 260 plus 26. System stats are greatly unbalanced, and the user is advised to improve the lacking stat to ensure proper growth. Once Mark was done adding points to his stats, he then started adding points to his skills. Mark only had one skill that he really needed to improve right now to make sure that the monsters didn't go after the other superhumans. Mark might not like the NSA, but that does not mean he wanted the other superhumans to die. They all came here for the same mission, and if Mark could help, then he would. Does the user wish to add skill points to the selected skills? Yes/no. Mark chose yes, and another prompt appeared. User has added 50 points to blunt force trauma. Probability of successful landing a critical attack. Plus 3% for every successful consecutive hit. Blunt force trauma. This skill heightens the probability of landing a critical hit as the user delivers consecutive successful punches to the enemy, harnessing the cumulative impact for devastating effectiveness. Critical attacks deal plus 100% extra damage to the enemy. Current rank, F rank, 51 out of 100. Probability of landing a critical attack, plus 3% for every successful consecutive hit. The blunt force trauma skill was going to be useful in getting rid of that low-level calamity. Mark just had to rack enough successful hits so that he would have a 100% chance of using a critical hit when he attacked the low-level calamity. The critical hit gives a 100% increase in damage, so it would be too shocking for the low-level calamity to adapt to it or avoid it. I'll get out when I get my friend out. Don't worry about me. Just run as quickly as you can, and I'll draw them in a different direction. Mark knew that the monsters were directly after him, so the chances that they would go after the two superhumans while Mark was going in the opposite direction were very low. He was sure they would get to the helicopter safely. Mark said his goodbyes to them, quickly turned in the opposite direction, and began to charge forward as he activated taunting. Taunting activating. Chances of successful taunting, 20%. Taunting successful. Call of the Night Wolves had been activated. A great wave of hostility slammed into Mark as he felt the hate of all the Animus in the region directed toward him. The forest started to rumble as the animals were now more rabid as they chased after him. Mark needed to deal with all the small fries that were chasing after him before going to deal with the Calamity class. Mark turned around just as the wave of hostility got close enough, and he lashed his hand out at the nearest monster beside him. Slam! Splat! The monster was only a low-level disaster class, and it didn't even expect for a moment that Mark's power would be as high as it was, and it was blindsided and disintegrated to paste as Mark lashed out with his punch. Mark didn't waste any time, and he rode off the momentum as he leaped off the tree beside him and used that to rocket himself towards the next monster. Slam! 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 Critical hit. Slam! User has killed 4 low-level disaster classes plus 60 stat points. User has killed 5 high-level disaster classes plus 100 stat points. Mark jumped from tree to tree and used the momentum to increase the power of his punches as he destroyed each monster he came across. He managed to get rid of all of them when he suddenly felt wind pressure against his skin, and he thanked his agility for allowing him to dodge in time for the large rock that was thrown at him to only sail past harmlessly. The fucker was back. Mark grinned as he turned and dashed straight for the Calamity class monkey. There were fewer monsters around now, so he could focus all his energy on the Calamity class without worrying about the other monsters. The monkey released a loud cry as it threw another rock at Mark, and Mark only needed to move to the side to dodge it as he continued running unimpeded. Mark could have destroyed the rock, but he didn't want to ruin his consecutive successful hit count. If he hit the rock, Mark didn't know if that would be counted as a successful hit or not, and he was going to save his next punch for when he got to the Calamity class. The Calamity class took a step back as it noticed the intensity that Mark was using to charge at it, and it shouted in anger as it felt threatened by Mark. Ooh, ooh, AH! The monkey shouted out a battle cry as it jumped off the tree and swung towards Mark before using its tail to lash out at Mark with great force. A monkey tail has enough strength to carry its whole body, and when that strength is increased to match the strength of a low-level Calamity class, it has enough power to eviscerate a house in only one swing. Whoosh! But the monkey hesitated at the last moment as it took a look into Mark's eyes and saw the bloodlust in there. It immediately realized that there was something wrong, and it was about to pull back to dodge the punch that Mark was preparing to unleash, but it was already too late. Critical hit. Kaboom! Kaboom! Tyler dashed across the forest with Fiona flung over his shoulder as he tried to get as far away from the monster behind him as possible. He paused as he felt the entire forest shake from a massive force, and he wanted to look around and see what that was, but he felt the aura of the monster again, and he forgot about that force as he started to run again. Things could not have gone any more wrong than they did just now. Tyler knew that it was impossible for this mission to be any more fucked up than it was at this fucking moment. There was only one question constantly running through Tyler's mind. What sort of monster did they run into? Tyler was a strong superhuman. He knew that he could handle Calamity classes if he went all out, and he was someone who felt great pride in his power. But the monster that appeared behind them was not something that he could call a simple Calamity class. If not for the fact that he already knew how strong Eldritch class and Armageddon class monsters were, Tyler would have thought that this monster something higher than a Calamity class. The anima chasing him was able to kill Archer in less than 10 seconds after the fight started, and Archer didn't even get a chance to use any of his abilities before he was crushed into a paste with nothing but raw strength. That already told Tyler that this was not a fight they could face head-on, but when the anima managed to shrug off Fiona's blessing with minimal effort, Tyler knew that they were fucked if they didn't get out of there at once. Tyler had never seen any Calamity class anima that could shrug off Fiona's blessing before, and the fact that this one could do it meant that this was not an ordinary anima. And yet, all that was nothing compared to the fact that this anima actually opened its mouth and spoke. Even after everything that the anima did to the superhumans, the fact that it could talk was still the most shocking of it all. Was this a dream? Perhaps. Tyler could simply believe that he was dreaming and he would wake up from it in a moment. But the feeling of dread that filled his heart and the adrenaline pumping through his body as he ran for his life told him that this was real. It made no sense that an anima would be able to talk. There has never been an instance where anima possessed such an ability. Immediately after hearing the anima talk, Tyler was about to tell Fiona to turn off her skill so that they could bolt, but it was already too late as the monster reached Fiona before Tyler could even mutter a word. He quickly engaged the anima and tried to draw it away from Fiona, but the monster ignored him and raced towards Fiona to finish her off. Fiona was able to use her blessing to slow the monster down for a few seconds. Even though the monster was far stronger than her, it still felt the effects of Fiona's blessing for a few seconds. And it was only this fact that allowed her to survive what happened next. Rather than simply killing Fiona like it planned to, the monster slammed into her with all its weight, and Fiona was thrown across the forest like a ping-pong ball. She already passed out before she crashed through 10 trees and dug a deep trench into the forest floor. Boom! The monster stumbled and seemed to be confused for a moment as it tilted its head and looked down at its feet while trying to assimilate what had just happened. That split-second delay in its reaction allowed Tyler to dash in and grab Fiona to get out of there as quickly as possible. Tyler started by running towards the helicopter, and he was going to try and get out of this island as quickly as possible. But when he felt the monster right behind him, He decided that it would be better not to run towards the helicopter since the monster could easily kill all the other superhumans that were also trying to escape the island. The monster was too strong, and Tyler couldn't stop it even if he tried, so he knew that it would easily kill all the A and B rank superhumans in the helicopter. A shadow fell over Tyler, and he turned around to see 3 large trees flying towards him. The leaves and large roots on the trees told Tyler that they were just pulled straight out from the soil, and Tyler cursed as he dashed to the side and tried to evade the trees. Boom! 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 The trees slammed into the ground and embedded themselves deep in the floor, and Tyler quickly tried to continue moving, but he wasn't able to get to his top speed quickly enough since his evasion of the trees shaved off some of his speed. How troublesome! Why do you run? A feeling of dread fell upon Tyler as he felt eyes behind him, and he turned around with a shout while releasing a massive wave of flames. Die! Fool! The flames traveled across the forest and destroyed hundreds of trees in their path. But Tyler didn't see the anima. Tyler held his breath and looked around at the flaming forest while waiting for something to happen. There was a deep, unnatural silence that permeated through the entire forest, and Tyler could almost feel his heart trying to burst out from his chest due to the intensity of the situation. Ugh! Fiona stirred from Tyler's shoulder, but Tyler didn't even have time to check on her as he noticed something moving through his flames. Tyler would never admit it to anyone, but watching the ant-headed anima stepping out from the fire like a demon straight out of hell put the fear of the Lord into him. For the first time in his life, Tyler felt his legs shake. Fuck! Tyler cursed, and he gently pushed Fiona to the ground. He knew in his heart that there was nothing that he could do to defeat this monster. Tyler has fought against hundreds of anima in the last 4 years, but none of them stood up to the sheer strength that this anima had. But he was not going to just turn around and let it catch and kill them both. Tyler was going to fight. Maybe he would win. Maybe Fiona would wake up and manage to run away before the monster killed him. Or maybe they would both die. It didn't matter what the outcome would be. Tyler was not going down without a fight. Tyler went into a fighting stance and prepared himself. Come on then. Let's see how much of you I can burn before I'm extinguished. The ant-headed anima tilted its head curiously as it saw Tyler getting into a fighting stance, and it seemed to be interested in what Tyler was going to do. It wondered why Tyler was willingly sacrificing himself all of a sudden. It thought that Tyler would run forever, but it seems that it was wrong. How interesting. Come on, you bastard. Fool him. Fool him. Fool him. 3 great pillars of fire burst to life as Tyler charged at the monster. He released another large wave of fire to distract the monster, and he dashed to the side and slammed his heel into a tree. The tree groaned as it began to fall, and Tyler grabbed it by the trunk. Fool him. The tree trunk caught on fire. Immediately Tyler touched it, and Tyler released another battle cry as he threw the tree straight at the monster like a javelin. Whoosh! The Calamity class simply rose its hand up, and the tree broke into pieces once it slammed into the hand. The anima grabbed the trunk and threw the tree to the side. What nonsense was this human trying to do? Does he think that a simple tree would be able to harm it? What foolishness! Rarg! Tyler suddenly appeared from behind the tree with his flaming fist drawn back. Rarg! Tyler suddenly appeared from behind the tree with his flaming fist drawn back. He used the tree as a distraction, and he was planning to catch the Calamity class off guard so he could get a hit in, but the result of his hard work was so disappointing as the Calamity class only raised its arm in the air once more and caught Tyler around the neck like a child. Tyler grabbed the Calamity class by the arm and tried to pry its hand off, but there was nothing that he could do as it was too strong. It felt impossible to even make the arm budge. What is this strength? On the other side of the clearing, Fiona had finally woken up, and she held her head in shock as she gently sat up and looked around at the burning bush. Why was she on the ground? She didn't remember anything that happened after. Oh yes, that monster attacked her and she used her blessing on it. But the blessing didn't work like she thought it would. Her blessing failed against a monster. That has never happened before. Fiona quickly looked up, and she was shocked when she saw Tyler being held by the Calamity class. She immediately stood up and began to think. She didn't know how she got here, But that didn't matter right now. She just needed to come up with a way to get Tyler out of the anima's grasp. She knew that even though her blessing didn't work against the anima like she expected it to, she was able to stall it for a few moments. Maybe she could use that to help Tyler. Fiona focused all of her mana, and she immediately spread out her blessing, using everything she had to try and grab the anima's attention. She might not be able to put it under her control, but she could distract it long enough to give Tyler a chance to escape. But this turned out to be the wrong choice. The only reason why Fiona's blessing worked against the anima the first time was that it had never felt it before, and it was surprised by the feelings of love and protectiveness for Fiona that suddenly appeared in its head. Now that the anima already knew what Fiona's blessing felt like, and it knew what sort of effects the blessing had on it, the anima was more resistant to the effects, and its resolve didn't even shake for a moment as it glanced at Fiona. There was a small twitch on the anima's face, and Fiona stumbled back as she realized that the anima was smiling. Fiona's mind went blank with shock at the unusual sight. Fiona has never fought against an anima this strong before, and she has never heard of an anima that was expressive in any way. Since when could they smile? Foolish human, your species have grown inept in their own hubris. I shall show you the error of your ways. The way of the wild. The anima began to squeeze down on Tyler's throat as it continued to look Fiona right in the eyes. Fiona felt true helplessness at that moment as she realized that she really couldn't do anything to help Tyler. Tyler was going to die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She took a step back as she prepared to bolt back to the helicopter. There was nothing she could do for Tyler, but perhaps she could save herself and tell the others back in City A about what happened here. They cannot allow these monsters to reach the city. A monster like this would absolutely eradicate their city from the map. Now, what do we have here? Another ant! Exclamation point. Fiona turned to the side in shock as she heard a familiar voice, and she could not contain the relief that spread across her entire body as she saw a figure strutting out from within the flames surrounding the forest. The black hair and muscular body immediately gave the identity away, and Fiona released a bated breath that she didn't even know she had been holding when she saw Mark. Mark was shirtless, and there were various scars across his body from the fight he had just come from. He was dragging the body of a large monkey-based anima behind him, and he dropped on the ground as he scanned over everything going on in the clearing. Mark only took a moment to scan everything around him, and he was able to deduce what had happened. Tyler was trying to protect Fiona, and he ended up biting off more than he could chew. This is exactly why Mark told them that they should have brought more people. The monsters here are far stronger than they predicted, and Mark knew that if not for the fact that he was here, then all of them would have died. The ant-headed anima immediately changed its focus once it saw Mark, and its eyes gleamed in surprise as it saw its main prey standing before it. It screeched in anger as it squeezed down harder on Tyler's neck, and Tyler screamed in pain as he felt his neck crack. Let go of him. The anima was stunned when Mark suddenly appeared beside it. Mark gripped its wrist and slowly twisted, and the anima started to loosen its grip around Tyler's neck involuntarily until it dropped Tyler to the ground. It immediately jumped back to get some distance between it and Mark as it felt its wrist throbbing in pain from Mark's grip. It rubbed its wrist and glanced at Mark in shock, but Mark was not even paying attention to it as he looked down at Tyler and made sure that Tyler was still breathing. Come and take him away, Fiona. Once Mark was sure that Tyler was alive, he turned to Fiona and called her over. Fiona jerked like she had just snapped out of a haze as she heard her name, but she managed to comport herself and slowly came forward till she was standing beside Tyler. Fiona kept glancing at the anima in front of them, and she was prepared to run in case there was any sign of an attack coming from the monster. But the anima did not move a muscle as it just kept looking at Mark. Don't worry about it. It's not going to attack you. Just take Tyler to the helicopter and try to get him some first aid before you guys leave. His neck is probably broken. Fiona nodded and she grabbed Tyler. Fiona jumped off the ground and into the trees before disappearing into the forest. Once she was gone, Mark turned to the monster with a small smile. Now that they're gone, how about we talk? You can talk, can't you, Ant? Do not call me an ant. I'm a proud anima. Mark folded his hands. Oh, but isn't that what you are? It's like telling me not to call a dog or a monkey a monkey. Regardless of how you look at it, you're nothing but an ant. But that is not what I wanted to talk about. I want to know where you take your prisoners. Are they kept in the tunnels below the island? The anima began to trek forward as it released a low screech. The great anima do not answer to mere humans. Boom! The anima shot off the ground and charged for Mark, and Mark could easily track its movement as it moved towards him. Mark's gaze was cold as he glared at the anima and dared it to come towards him. The anima immediately felt a shiver go through its spine as it saw those eyes. The anima immediately felt a shiver run down its spine as it saw those eyes, and it unconsciously made a decision not to charge straight for Mark. Instead, it dashed to the side, attempting to blindside Mark from behind. It charged at Mark again and released a punch that would have destroyed a mountain, but Mark put his hand up and easily caught the punch in his grip. Boom! A massive wind pressure rose from the point of contact, and Mark's hair was blown back from the intensity. Mark squeezed down on the monster's arm, and the monster screeched as it tried to pull its arm back. But no matter what it tried, it couldn't make Mark loosen his grip. After killing the monkey anima, Mark was able to gain 100 skill points. Mark sent all of his skill points straight to his full body constitution, and his previous constitution, Soldier Ant Constitution, evolved into a new one called Reiju, Thunder God. Reiju, Thunder God. This constitution skill enhances the practitioner's entire body, imbuing them with the electrifying power of a thunder god, allowing heightened speed, strength, and the ability to discharge electricity in combat. Effects: Full body augmentation, X20. Stunner. Enemies one rank below the user will receive an automatic 2-second stun effect upon first contact with the user. A/N. The full body augmentation skill measures how much power Mark's body can hold. It is not a multiplier for his power. The previous full body constitution only strengthened his body to 10 times its mortal limits, and this constitution takes it one step further. Superhuman system. Name: Mark Vanitas. Race: human. Title: He Who Perseveres Through Hell. Plus 10% increase to all stats. Rank: A2120/3000. Affiliation: True Good. And use stat points: 160. And use skill points: 50. Strength: 820 plus 82 plus 80. Stamina: 650 plus 65 plus 58. Agility: 650 plus 65 plus 13. Durability: 510 plus 51. Mana: 260 plus 26. System stats are greatly unbalanced, and the user is advised to improve the lacking stat to ensure proper growth. Skill tree. Dash full body constitution. This is a unique skill tree enabling the user to systematically enhance and fortify every aspect of their physical form, elevating strength and resilience to unprecedented levels. Current full body constitution: Reiju Thunder God, 1 of 200. Reiju Thunder God. This constitution skill enhances the user's entire body, imbuing them with the electrifying power of a thunder god, granting heightened speed, strength, and the ability to manipulate and discharge electricity in combat. Effects: Full body augmentation, X20. Stunner. Enemies one rank below the user will receive an automatic 2-second stun effect upon first contact with the user. Dash Mana Circulation. Mana Circulation is a skill enabling the user to enhance the efficiency of mana distribution throughout their body, optimizing energy flow for heightened senses and greater strength. Current Mana Circulation stage: F rank, 11 out of 100. Stat improvements due to application of mana. Strength, plus 6%. Stamina, plus 6%. Agility, plus 2%. Dash Taunting. This skill lures enemies with a lower rank towards the user, diverting their attention from all distractions and encouraging aggressive engagement. Current taunting variation: Call of the Night Wolves, F rank, 1 out of 100. Probability of successful taunting based on level, 20%. Dash Blunt Force Trauma. This skill heightens the probability of landing a critical hit as the user delivers consecutive successful punches to the enemy, harnessing the cumulative impact for devastating effectiveness. Critical attacks deal plus 100% extra damage to the enemy. Current rank, F rank, 51 out of 100. Probability of landing a critical attack, plus 3% for every successful consecutive hit. Mark grinned and dragged the anima closer as electricity began to spark around him. The stunning effect of his full body constitution didn't activate, but the anima still felt an intense jolt of electricity that immediately made it try to pull back in shock. Let me teach you some life lessons, Ant. 1. You should never get this close to a brawler. Boom, boom, boom. 3 consecutive punches slammed into the anima's stomach, and it felt its feet leave the ground as it was carried into the air from the force of the punches. The anima immediately tried to perform an axe kick to take Mark's head off, but Mark ducked under the kick and used the momentum of the movement to stretch out the arm he was already holding. Lesson 2. Don't ever give a brawler your arm. Crack. Rip. The sound of bone breaking and flesh tearing resonated across the entire region as Mark ripped the arm he had been holding out from the socket. The anima screamed in pain as it stumbled back from Mark and held its stump in pain. Mark looked down at the hand that he took from the anima before he scoffed and began to walk towards the anima with a foreboding aura around him. Damn human scum. The anima screeched as it charged for Mark with a vengeful gaze, but Mark easily dodged around the monster's attack and used its torn arm to slam it in the face. The monster flew back, and it tried to rush to its feet, but it was not fast enough to stop a massive kick from Mark that slammed into its back and sent it to the ground. The anima screeched at Mark threateningly as it rushed to its feet and shot off. Mark prepared to block in case the anima was planning to attack, but the anima immediately changed trajectory at the last moment and shot off into the forest as it realized that Mark was far stronger than it. It would not be sensible to fight against Mark in a straight fight, so it needed to draw Mark down into the tunnel so the other anima in the tunnel could help it. Boom! The anima was blindsided by a sudden impact, and it flew through a tree at the side as it was thrown off its feet. Mark jumped towards the monster with a mad look in his eyes as he used the anima's torn arm to smash its head in. Boom! Another great tremor echoed through the forest, and Mark just continued the onslaught as he relentlessly beat the anima. He grabbed the anima by its head when it tried to escape, and he slammed its face into a tree. The anima struggled in Mark's grip until it managed to finally loosen Mark's grip. It turned around and spat a toxic substance out. Hiss! Mark immediately jumped back in surprise as the liquid oozed out from the anima's mouth and sprayed over his stomach. He looked down at his abs where the spit touched him and waited to see if there would be any effects, but thankfully his constitution was too strong for the spit to penetrate, and it just oozed off him. Mark then watched as the anima bolted off once more. He narrowed his eyes for a moment and thought about chasing after it, but then a better idea crossed Mark's head, and he allowed himself to relax as he began to jog after the anima. Mark was certain that the anima would try to go back to a place where there were reinforcements, and it was most likely the same place where they kept their prisoners. Mark didn't know how large the underground tunnels were, but if the tunnels covered the entire island, then it would be impossible for him to find Aerith in that maze. It would be far more sensible for him to just allow the anima to take him as close as possible to the center of the maze. Lesson 3. Always stay one step ahead of the enemy. In the underground tunnels, James and the other members of the team that went below ground trekked forward with their senses at high alert and a cautious air around them. The first thing that told James that this was going to be a terrible fight was the feeling he had once he entered the tunnels. James couldn't explain it, even if he tried. There was this unnatural foreboding that he had never felt before spreading across the entire cave. It almost felt like he was in the den of a wild beast, and the beast was simply watching from a distance and waiting for him to come closer. But James didn't heed his internal feelings because he knew that he needed to go deeper into the cave to see what was inside. James, Meta, and the other A-rank and B-rank superhumans all trekked deeper into the cave, and they found a pathway that went down for a long time. It was lined with multiple glowing green lights, illuminating from rocks that protruded from the cave wall. They eventually came across some monsters along the way, and they were able to dispatch them easily because they were low-level monsters that didn't pose any real danger to them. James and Meta didn't even need to intervene, as the A-rank and B-rank superhumans were able to easily destroy these monsters. This raised their morale for some time as they continued on their way. They thought that the monsters down here would be weak, since the ones that they had met were all weak, but James and Meta knew that this would not be the case. They told the other superhumans to keep their eyes peeled and to not get too relaxed because they could meet a calamity class at any point. But the other superhumans were too happy about how easy it was for them to destroy the previous monsters, and they didn't listen. Boom! The sound of fighting coming from above them was the only indication they received that something had gone desperately wrong above ground. They could not even understand what had happened before another long, intense tremor made the tunnel shake, and they were forced to move faster, so they would not get buried under the falling rocks. They moved quickly through the tunnel, and they finally reached a small cave that split into two different pathways on the left and right. The entire group stopped as James and Meta both realized immediately that this was a problem. James and Meta were the only two S-rank superhumans there, and the rest of them were only A-ranks and B-ranks. That meant that they would have to split the S-ranks into two groups if they wanted to really search the tunnels and take care of any monsters in the caves. James wondered what would happen if they were to encounter a monster that an S-rank could not defeat inside those caves. Suddenly, a man spoke up from behind James. "We should just split up. Half of us should go with James, and the other half will go with Meta. You are both strong, so I'm sure that there will be no issues if each group has one of you." The person who spoke was called Greg. He was a member of the NSA that worked directly under James. He had a lot of experience in the superhuman world, but he didn't have as much experience on the battlefield since he was only a bank clerk before he became a superhuman 4 years ago. He was an A-rank that had a blessing from Hermes. This made him extremely fast, and he tended to handle orders very efficiently. But he was not very good at making tactical decisions. James knew that splitting up would be the best option, but he was still worried that there was a monster here that was stronger than an S-rank. But suspicion was not enough reason for him to stop the team since they were all on the same page. Even Meta eventually agreed and told James that he would go down the left tunnel, while James should go down the right tunnel. The monsters that they already encountered down here were too weak, and so the monster ahead would probably be weak enough for them to handle as well. Yeah, let's just finish up quickly and go help the others up on the surface. I need to get back home to my girlfriend later. Let's finish up quickly. There's no way a mere monster can kill all of us if we gang up on it. We have S ranks, so we will be fine. We can finish this in no time. James sighed internally, and he relented when he heard everyone voicing their agreement. He knew it would be impossible to argue against all of them, since they seemed to have all come to the same decision together. They wanted to split up, and that was fine by James. But this decision would turn out to be the worst choice they could have ever made. James took half of the A and B ranks and walked down the right tunnel, while Meta took the other half and walked down the left tunnel. Be careful over there and try to come back in one piece. I wouldn't want to start explaining to Talia how I couldn't get her old man out. That was the last thing Meta said to James before they both separated and entered the different tunnels. It was the last time they would ever speak to each other. James kept his eyes peeled as they went deeper into the tunnel with his smaller team. The tunnel was still illuminated by the crystals, so there was no need for them to light it up, but James couldn't help but feel like something was watching him from the shadows. He narrowed his eyes and looked around calmly before he stopped as another tremor shook the entire region from the surface. Boom! James immediately wondered if that tremor was coming from the fight against the monsters up there. James didn't think that it would escalate to this level, since there are many superhumans with Fiona and Tyler. They even have Archer, so shouldn't the fight already be over if Archer was watching their back? Don't tell me they ran into the monster that was too strong for Archer to snipe. That's impossible. Archer has one of the strongest long-range skills. He should be able to handle calamity classes easily from a distance. Boom! Another tremor passed through the cave, and James heard the other people with him murmuring amongst themselves as they looked around at all the falling debris in the cave. But he was not looking around like they were. Instead, his eyes were transfixed on one particular spot on the ceiling where he could see a crystal protruding from. He narrowed his eyes, and he reached out and touched one of the superhumans blessed by the god of fire. "Put a light over there." The superhuman looked up in surprise, and she saw that the spot James was talking about was already well illuminated by a green crystal. Why would one have a light over there? But James insisted on it, and the superhuman didn't have any choice as she brought her hand up and lit a flame. Foom! Her entire face paled as she felt her heart drop down to her stomach in dread. She took a step back immediately as she shouted at the top of her lungs, "Anima! Enhance! Anima!" There was a giant lizard-type anima hanging on the ceiling at the exact spot that the crystal was protruding from, but for some reason they could not see the anima when it was only being illuminated by the light of the crystal. It was only when the flames covered it that they were able to see where it was. The anima immediately raced out from the light of the flames, and everyone in the cave went into a fighting stance as the anima disappeared into the light of another crystal. James shouted at the flame user to bring up a large bonfire. They needed to create more light so they could see where the anima went. But before James could chase after the anima, he was blindsided by another anima who appeared from behind and slammed into him. Boom! The anima sent James into the wall, and James put his hand in front of his face as the anima used its leg to kick James deeper into the rock. What the hell is this power? This anima was nothing like the one they faced when they came to the tunnel. That anima was just a disaster class, but this one was definitely a calamity class. It had to be on the same level of power as the anima that Mark fought in the city. The new anima was also a lizard-type anima, but this one was standing on two legs and looked more like a lizard man than a lizard. James dragged himself out from a hole before the lizard man could hit him again, and he quickly tackled the lizard man with a loud shout. "Focus on the other anima. I'll handle this one." Once James shouted this out to the other superhumans, he dragged the lizard man a few steps away from the superhumans before he drew back to try and get some space between them. The lizard man immediately swung its large tail at James. But James wasted no time as he lashed out with a punch of his own while activating his blessing. Tune! Boom! A loud musical note rang out from his fist as it impacted against the anima, and the anima roared in anger as its tail was almost torn off from the force behind the punch. James charged in and dodged under another tail swing as he grabbed the anima's legs and roared in anger as he dragged it into the air and made the anima fall on its side. He immediately sent a punch down at the anima, but it was able to grab James by the head and toss him into the wall of the cave before the punch hit. Boom! The anima slowly got to its feet and stormed over to James. It lashed out with a massive punch, and James reared his head back and used his forehead to counter the punch. Tune! Boom! Another musical note rang out as James released sound wave from his forehead and used it to amplify the intensity of his headbutt. If not for that trick, James would have definitely lost his head at that moment. But he was able to counter the punch, and the anima stumbled back, and this gave James some time to recuperate as he dragged himself out from the wall again. He needed to find a way to kill this thing, so he could go help the A and B ranks that he left behind. James didn't know how strong that other lizard-based anima was, but James knew that it would be difficult to deal with it because of how it used the illumination of the caves to hide itself. If that anima is anything like this one, then the A and B ranks would not stand a chance. Rarga! James dashed at the anima and used all of his strength to tackle the anima back into the wall of the cave. Boom! The two of them burst through the wall, and they appeared in another part of the tunnel. There was a steep fall right on the edge of the new area, and James had to struggle to hold onto the edge of the wall so he wouldn't fall down into the darkness below. The lizard man was holding tight to James' leg with its claws, and James immediately used his blessing to release a large burst of sound wave from his legs, dislodging the monster from his leg and making it fall down into the darkness below. But before it even went far, the lizard reached out with its claws and grabbed hold of the cliff face to stop itself from falling. If you looked closely enough, you would see thousands of sharp stalagmites and spikes down there, and it would mean certain death if they fell into the trench from this height. I'm too old for this shit. Just die already, you fucking lizard. James could only curse as he forced himself back to the top with a lot of effort. His leg was throbbing from the wound the lizard inflicted with its claws, and James knew that he was bleeding without even looking at it. It was throbbing and spewing blood constantly because of how much effort he was exerting to stay standing. Roar! The lizard man was also able to reach the top quickly, and it charged at James again as the both of them began to exchange blows right on the cliff edge. Boom! 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 James knew that one mistake from him would end up with his death, and he tried his best to draw the monster toward the cliff while also making sure not to put too much weight on his injured leg. He dodged under one of the monster's swipes, and he released one of his largest punches right into the monster's stomach to make it stumble back in surprise. He grabbed its tail once it lashed out, and he dragged the monster closer to him and smashed another punch into the monster's back. The monster roared in anger and used its hind legs to kick James in the stomach. James stumbled back, and he was forced to put a lot of weight on his injured leg as he immediately stopped himself from stumbling too close to the edge. He got his balance, and he was able to get back into the fight, but a scream from one of the superhumans that he left behind made him turn his head to glance at what was happening. That was his only mistake. Squelch! A deep gash appeared over James' shoulder as he was cut through by the lizardman's claws, and his eyes widened as blood sprayed out over the floor. He immediately gained some distance between him and the monster while holding his shoulder in pain, but the monster didn't even bother chasing after him because it could already be seen that James was going to lose. A small upturning of its lips shocked James, and James narrowed his eyes in anger once he saw it. It was laughing. James fell to one knee as the blood loss from both his shoulder and his leg was starting to get to him. He was going to die here if he didn't stop the bleeding. The lizard man only watched James for a few moments before another scream echoed from the superhumans outside. The superhumans outside were only able to hold the stealthy lizard for a few seconds, but they were severely overpowered because of how elusive it was. Most of them died due to the lizard's stealthy attacks and raw brute strength, and now only 3 of them were remaining. The lizard man turned to walk back into the cave so it could get some of the humans as well. If it left the stealthy lizard to its own devices, then the stealthy lizard would eat all the humans and leave nothing for it. The 3 remaining superhumans were standing in a small semicircle with their backs against the wall, and they all held out their weapons to keep the lizard away. James's assistant, Greg, the female fire-based superhuman, and another A-rank superhuman who uses a sword and his wind blessing to fight were the only ones left. The fire-based superhuman was still using her flame to illuminate the area so that they could see the lizard, but she was already crying in despair as she knew that she would not be making it out of there alive. She should have just stayed as a firewoman instead of coming to join the NSA. At least if she was a firewoman, she wouldn't be facing monsters like these. Stop crying and think of a way out of here instead. These monsters will kill you whether you cry or not. Greg was the only one of the 3 who was still calm, and he swore that he would not go down without a fight. He held a long staff in front of him to keep the lizard at a distance as he tried to think of a way out of there. Greg was blessed by the god of speed himself, and he knew that if he ran away now, he might manage to get far before the lizard came after him. But Greg refused to run away. He was not going to abandon his comrades here because he knew that once he left, they would definitely be killed. Greg was going to stay here and try to think of a way for all of them to survive. We should have done more research into this island. I thought the monsters here were only disaster classes and 1 or 2 calamity classes. These monsters are far stronger than any we've seen in the city before. The superhuman with wind magic shouted out in anger as he glanced at the steadily approaching lizard. He thought they would be able to come here and clean out the entire island because of their numbers, but things were looking grave right from the start. He didn't know what was happening up on the surface, but he knew that things were surely better over there than down here. Greg shook his head and tried to keep his cool while his heart was threatening to beat out of his chest. Just stay calm. I'm sure the chairman will finish off the other lizard, and he'll come help us soon. Just remain calm. Step, step, step. The sound of footsteps made Greg and the others look up, and they were all shocked to see the second lizard man who was fighting against the chairman walking out from a hole in the wall and coming towards them. The lizard man grunted at the stealthy lizard, and the two of them almost seemed to have an argument in some strange language before they both turned to the humans. Greg was in too much shock to think, but he knew that what just happened was an agreement between them to share the humans. Greg swallowed in fright and took a step back. The fact that the lizard man was here meant that James lost the fight. Did the lizard man already kill James? If that was true, then there was nothing any of them could do to stop the lizard from eating them. Should he just run? Turning your back to an enemy? What an insult! A hand suddenly grabbed the two lizards by their tails as James appeared out from the hole in the wall, with blood leaking all over him. Greg couldn't see James because the lizard men were blocking his view, but he heard James shout loudly, "Greg, you better take care of Talia, you useless bastard." James had a bloody smile on his face as the image of his granddaughter passed through his head at that moment. He knew that she would not be happy about his death. She would probably cry and hate him for some time, but there was no question that she would be just fine. Talia was strong, and she would be able to cope even if he wasn't there with her. The lizards suddenly felt a great pull drag them backward as James raced for the hole in the wall. He released a large sound wave from his feet into the ground to propel himself through the hole and straight over the cliffside. Roar! The two lizards were not able to react quickly enough, and they were just dragged along in the suicide charge as James took all three of them down into the darkness below. And through all this, his laughter echoed all through the cave. "I love you, Talia." Greg ran over to the edge of the cliff and looked down in shock. There was no sound for more than a minute before a loud sound of bodies being skewered echoed through the entire cave. Greg closed his eyes and grit his teeth in anger. He could feel tears coming to his eyes, and he didn't bother trying to stop them as he used the back of his hand to clean his eyes over and over again. "I'll look after her, James. I promise." Greg got to his feet while making a promise to James, and he looked up and tried his hardest to calm the tears that just wouldn't stop. After he finally managed to calm himself, he entered back through the hole to meet the other two superhumans who managed to survive. The female flame user was sitting on the floor and breathing heavily while looking down at the ground, and the male wind user was folding his hands and resting his back against the wall. He was also staring at the ground, and they both remained silent as they thanked James for what he did for them. "We have to start moving. James saved us here, but we don't know if there are any other monsters around. It will be dangerous to stay here any longer, so we need to get back to the helicopter and get out of this island. We should have never come here in the first place." Greg suddenly spoke up once he was close enough to the both of them. They needed to get out of here before they ran into any more monsters. James saved them this time, and Gigi knew that if they encountered another monster like those two lizards, there was no chance of them coming out alive. The female shivered and held her hands close to her body as she looked back at the hole James fell out of. "What if there are more monsters down the path we came from? I don't think I have enough mana to fight even a weak disaster class right now. We will have to risk it. I haven't heard any tremors from above, so it is likely that the fighting is finished up there. Either that, or..." Greg stopped speaking as he didn't even want to utter the words that came to his mind. But the other two already knew what Greg was about to say, and they silently gulped as they realized that it was also a possibility. What if the monsters up there were just as strong as these two lizards they just fought against, and everyone on the surface was dead? What will they do if they cannot even get to the helicopter? We should call for reinforcements. Maybe the other guilds will send more help when they hear about this. The male superhumans pushed off the wall and spoke up confidently. He was sure that the other guilds would never leave them here to die if they knew the strength of the monsters here. But Greg just shook his head. Greg was there when the chairman sent a message out to all the guilds and asked for their assistance. and they all ignored the request. They weren't obligated to help, and so they weren't going to. It is unlikely that those bastards would try to help them now. It is more likely that the other guilds will ignore the message. Only the NSA will help us, and we don't have enough superhumans left to take on this sort of situation. We should just get to the top first and find out what happened. Speculating is only going to make us paranoid. The other two nodded to what Greg said as they saw the sense in his words, and they decided to make their way back to the surface before they made any more decisions. Boom! They were about to start heading back, but a large tremor suddenly shook the entire tunnel, and they had to hold onto the wall beside them to prevent themselves from falling. Greg looked down the tunnel in shock. What the hell was that? Two figures flashed across the cave. Whoosh! You are more monster than I. No one would expect a scream like this to come from the mouth of a literal monster as it ran from a human. But that was exactly what happened as Mark chased down the ant anima through the tunnels under the island. Mark knew that the ant anima would try to get reinforcements, so he allowed it to move ahead and followed it till it came down to this tunnel. But once Mark found the entrance to the tunnel, he didn't need the anima anymore, and now he was going to kill it. There were green stones lining the walls of the tunnel and illuminating the underground tunnel, and Mark would have found it beautiful at any other time. But right now, his gaze was fixed on the anima. He just didn't have any time for sightseeing. Whoosh! Mark zoomed down the tunnel as he chased after the anima that was currently running away from him like he was a monster. The anima was bolting like a bat straight out of hell, and it knew that looking back even once would be dangerous because Mark was right on its tail. It dashed straight through the tunnels before reaching the two openings that split the tunnels into two paths. The anima quickly went down the right path. It wanted to lead Mark towards the two large lizard-type anima that were down this path, so they could help it defeat Mark. The addition of those two low-level Calamity-class anima would greatly increase its chances against Mark, and they could take Mark down together. But the anima couldn't even get all the way down the tunnel before it felt a hand brush against its back and grab it by the arm. Why are you running at? I thought you were better than me. Boom. Critical hit. Once Mark grabbed hold of the anima, he wasted no time as he dragged the anima back while delivering a devastating punch into the anima's side. The anima crashed into the tunnel wall, and Mark was surprised when the wall broke and the anima fell through the wall and down a steep cliff that appeared on the other side. Mark walked to the edge of the cliff, and he saw that the anima was holding on with its one good hand while staring up at Mark with a glare. Mark looked down at the deep darkness below, and he only smiled as he saw the sharp spikes below. Resorting to dirty tricks for victory is exactly what I would expect from a human. Cowardly scum. Mark raised a surprised brow as he used his heel to step on the anima's fingers. Screech. Smash! The anima screeched in pain, but Mark ignored its noise as he started to grind his heel into its fingers with increasing force. Mark knew that slamming his feet into the ground over and over again would only make the platform crack, and he might go over the edge of the cliff with the anima, so he was going to make it impossible for the anima to hold on instead. Mark didn't stop grinding his heel until the anima lost its grip on the cliff and fell down the dark cliff edge and into the darkness below. It kept its glare fixed on Mark until it disappeared, and Mark only tilted his head to the side with a wicked grin across his face as he watched it. Mark would not call himself a particularly vindictive person, but he was not above savoring the feeling of joy that comes with watching your enemy plummet to his death. The anima called him a monster? What nonsense! What would a monster like you know about being human? You can only call yourself a genuine being when you've experienced both the good and bad sides of your emotions. Freaks like you that only savor killing and destruction will never understand the beauty of humanity. Mark said this as he watched the anima until it finally disappeared, and it took a few extra seconds before Mark finally saw the message from his system. User had killed 1 low-level Calamity class plus 100 skill points. Mark didn't waste any time as he opened his tab and moved his skill points to his 2 most important skills. Mark had 150 skill points right now, and he decided that he would use them all. Does a user wish to add points to the selected skills? Yes/no. Mark chose yes, and the free skill points climbed down to 0 as they were transferred to the skills he chose. User had added 89 points to mana circulation. Current mana circulation, E rank 0 out of 200. Stat improvements due to application of mana. Strength, plus 10%. Stamina, plus 10%. Agility, plus 10%. User has added 61 skill points to Blunt Force Trauma. Current rank, E rank 2 out of 200. Probability of landing a critical attack, plus 4% for every successful consecutive hit. Once Mark was done with this, he then sent the remaining stat points that he had into his mana stat. There were only 160 stat points left, and Mark knew that it would be best to use them to increase his mana, so that the mana would increase his other stats as well. Since mana and mana circulation work together to increase his stats, the higher his mana and mana circulation, then the higher his other stats would be. Does the user wish to add points to the selected stat? Yes/no. Mark selected the yes option, and the system immediately sent the stats to mana. User had added 160 stat points to mana. Mana, 280/462. Mark frowned as he checked the amount of mana that he had left after adding in the mana points that he already had. There was barely half of his original amount left, and it only got up to that point because of the extra stat points that he added to mana. Mark knew that it was supposed to be much lower than that. Mark decided that he would have to find a way to get more mana as soon as possible. There were still some lower-ranked Calamity classes that he hadn't killed yet. The cause of his drastic drop in mana was probably from the use of his mana circulation skill. As of right now, Mark was still just an A rank, and the only thing that allowed him to fight on equal footing as all Calamity class monsters he has been going up against was the fact that he had so many good skills. Most of Mark's skills were helping to boost his regular stats by 10% or more, and that was compounding to make him stronger. Mark knew that he had been relying on mana circulation for too long already, and he would need to increase his strength so that he would not get into trouble if he ever ran out of mana in the middle of a fight. Imagine running out of mana in the middle of a fight and suddenly ending up with only half or two-thirds of your regular strength. That would not end well. Mark decided that once he was done here, he would improve both his regular strength-based stats and his mana. It is always better to have more strength. Mark now had to find out where the other low-ranking Calamity classes were. He should probably kill them and increase his mana capacity before going to face off against the high-ranking Calamity classes. Mark already learned his lesson about the differences in strength between low and high-ranking classes in Anima. The Anima that he just fought was a low-ranking Calamity class, and it was nothing like the high-ranking Disaster classes. Mark knew that the high-level Calamity class would be far stronger than the low-level Calamity class he just fought. The Anima that he just fought was a low-level Calamity class, and it was nothing like the high-ranking Disaster classes. This Calamity class could probably take on 50 Disaster classes all on its own, and it would be fine. That meant that the high-level Calamity class would be far stronger than the low-level Calamity class. Mark knew he had to be at his very best if he wanted to stand a chance against it. Mark turned and began to walk out to continue down the tunnel again, but footsteps from down the tunnel made him pause as he immediately brought up his guard again. Mark peered with narrowed eyes into the darkness of the tunnel, and he finally calmed down when he noticed that the people coming towards him were human. There were 2 men and a woman coming to him. One of the men was holding the woman upright with her hand over his shoulder, and the second man that was leading the way. Mark didn't recognize any of them, but it was obvious that they recognized him because they immediately started coming towards him. Vanitas, is it you? What in the world are you doing here? Greg was the one leading from the front, and he couldn't stop his surprise from showing once he saw Mark. He thought that Mark would get stuck on the surface since he didn't come with the other superhumans. The monsters up there were far more than the monsters down here, so Greg assumed that Mark would not be able to come down here. But the fact that Mark was here immediately made Greg optimistic about the surface. Mark being here must mean that the superhumans up on the surface managed to defeat the Anima there. Where are the other superhumans? Are they going down the other tunnel? Are they coming from behind you? We need a healer to help with some of the injuries here. Why aren't you saying anything? Greg just kept talking optimistically as he looked down the tunnel, but his voice slowly died out as he realized that Mark was not saying anything in response. Mark was just looking at him with a hard stare that showed no emotion. Greg asked Mark what was wrong and why he was looking at him like that. "Where is everybody, Mark?" Mark didn't like the look that Greg was giving him. That hopeful shine in Greg's eyes would only make things worse for him when he learns about what happened up there. "I don't know how many survived exactly, but most of the superhumans up there were killed by the anima. They were overwhelmed by the sheer number, and they couldn't fight back or change their strategy quickly enough to survive. I was only able to save about 5 or 6 people, but for the rest, I don't know. They might be dead or not." Greg felt all his energy leave him at once immediately after he heard this, and it was only through sheer will that he didn't fall to his knees. He closed his eyes in despair as he felt a great wave of anguish pass through him. What is the meaning of all this? They came here with almost 50 people, and they were all dead? Was this really how great the difference between them and the anima was? The 2 superhumans behind Greg were also bowing their heads, and they were silent as they contemplated what they were going to do now. The only thing they could hope for was that the helicopter pilot was not killed. That was the only way they could get off this damn island of death. Mark suddenly spoke up to break the depressing silence that settled on the 3 superhumans. He knew that they were sad about their comrades dying, but he didn't have time to waste here. He had to find Erit before something happened to her. "You said that there was another tunnel. Do you know which of the tunnels leads to the main chamber here? I need to find my way deeper into that chamber." Once Mark said this, Greg looked up in shock. What nonsense was Mark talking about? He still wanted to go deeper into the main chamber? After everything that already happened? Don't be crazy, Vanitas. This mission is already messed up, and there is no need for you to go deeper into the tunnels. What we need to do now is to find a way out of here so we can get back to the mainland. Mark narrowed his eyes and spoke dismissively. "You can leave if you want to, but I am not leaving without my friend. I came here without any of you, and I will finish my mission alone if I have to." "Don't be stupid. We should go back and tell the government about this, so they can blow this island to hell. Your friend is probably already dead." Mark grabbed Greg by his collar and dragged him off his feet easily. Greg was shocked by how easy it was for Mark to lift him off his feet and into the air so that his toes were barely touching the ground. Greg was no pushover, and he knew that he was fast. So how in the world was Mark able to grab him so quickly? "I'll only let it go once because I don't know who the fuck you are, but if you ever talk about letting her die again, I'll tear your heart out of your chest. No one is blowing anything up until I have my friend. Now, what is the direction to the main chamber?" Greg glared at Mark and immediately thought about attacking him in anger. This fool was going to get them all killed because of his teenage crush. Mark was still just a teenager, and Greg was sure that this was just his hormones telling him to keep moving forward like some sort of stupid superhero. He was only doing this because it was a female friend that was captured, and he wanted to feel like a hero. But then an image of his own children flashed in front of his mind, and Greg closed his eyes and forced himself to calm down. He was being too rash right now. It was only his fear that was telling him to abandon a young girl to these monsters and kill her. If James heard what Greg just said to Mark, then James would have beaten the crap out of him. "Yeah, sorry. I shouldn't have spoken about your friend like that. Can you drop me? I'll tell you whatever you want to know." Mark raised a brow at how quickly Greg agreed to help him. He thought that Greg would put up more of a fight than this. Greg was a very level-headed person, and he always thought about things from more than one perspective before taking action. Greg knew that Mark would not agree to go back, and Greg understood because he would have done the same if it was his son or daughter that the anima took. Mark finally set Greg back on the ground calmly, and Greg straightened out his shirt with a small frown before turning to point down the dark tunnel. "There's a blockage leading down that way, so I don't think this is the main tunnel leading to the chamber. If you follow us back, then you can follow the other tunnel down the left side and go to the chamber. I think you will have a better chance if you follow that path. There's a blockage leading down that way, so I don't think this is the main tunnel leading to the chamber. If you follow us back, then you can take the other tunnel down the left side and go to the chamber. I think that will be better." Mark glanced back at the dark tunnel and hummed as he thought about what to do. It was a long way back, and it would just be a waste of time to turn back now when he had already come this far. Mark reached out his hand and touched the wall beside him. Knock, knock, knock. This might work. Mark muttered as he knocked on the wall for a second time. There was a hollow sound from the other side of the wall, and Mark realized that the two tunnels might be connected through the wall. Ant tunnels like these are usually connected for a few hundred meters before they fully branch out and separate to different sides of the cave. He pulled back his hand and unleashed a punch. Boom! The punch tore a hole through the wall, and Greg watched in stunned silence as the wall crumbled and revealed the other tunnel right in front of them. That was really impressive. Greg didn't know how, but the walls down here were extremely thick. He noticed during the fight between James and the lizard men that they were not able to break through the walls even after hitting it multiple times. It only broke when it suffered too much damage. The fact that Mark was able to break a hole through the wall in one punch was insane. You guys can go back to the helicopter. I sent Fiona and Tyler there, so you should be fine if you can make it to the beach. Just stay clear of the forest, and there shouldn't be any surprise attacks from anima. Once Mark said this, he passed through the hole he made in the wall and began to run down the tunnel. Mark ran for a few seconds before he finally stopped as he noticed someone was following him. Mark turned and saw that it was Greg following him, and he gave Greg a look of irritation as he asked Slash, "What the hell are you doing? Aren't you meant to be going with the other two? I want to come with you." Mark narrowed his eyes once he heard Greg say this. Why would Greg want to come with him? There is no sensible reason why Greg would want to go deeper into the danger after everything that he already went through. Go back and help the other two get out of the tunnel. Don't push yourself too hard. Greg glared at Mark once Mark said this and ran his hands through his hair multiple times as he spoke. I'm not pushing myself. I just need to go and make sure that the other superhumans that went in here are all right. Look, James is dead, and since he is dead, I'm the only one who can look out for the superhumans from the NSA. I know that you're focused on your friend, and you will probably not have any time to help anyone that you see, so I'll handle that and allow you to do whatever you want. Mark's eyes widened minutely once he heard what Greg said. James was dead? How the hell did that happen? Mark couldn't believe that the same man he just fought earlier this evening was already dead. But even though Mark was shocked, he didn't allow himself to stay that way for long, and he eventually accepted what happened easily. The world was no longer a safe place since the Armageddon appeared 4 years ago. It was a dangerous place where someone you met yesterday could wind up dead today just by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It happened all the time over the past 4 years, and Mark had already gotten used to it. He just accepted that James was gone, and he nodded at Greg. Stay close to me and try not to go too far. We don't know what sort of anima is lurking in here, so it can end badly if you encounter something that is stronger than you. You understand? Mark immediately gave Greg some conditions for following him. Mark was not going to be held responsible for what would happen if Greg didn't fall in line, and Mark was making it known from the start. Greg nodded seriously as Mark said this. It sounded like Mark was giving him orders, but Greg was not in any position to reprimand Mark, because Greg knew that Mark was far stronger than him, and Mark was the one who would be protecting him here. Greg was blessed by Hermes, the god of speed, so he was one of the fastest A-rank superhumans alive. He was damn good at running away, but he didn't know if he could run fast enough to get away from whatever they encountered down these tunnels. Once Mark saw Greg nod, he began to run again. Mark raced at his full speed, and he noticed that Greg was able to keep up with him. Mark was glad that Greg wasn't slow. It would have been a pain in the ass if he had to slow down, because Greg couldn't keep up with him. Whoosh! The two superhumans flew through the tunnels at high speed, and they were about to pass through another low arch when they stopped as Mark raised his hand. Mark sniffed the air and immediately narrowed his eyes as a familiar smell permeated through his nose. Mark knew that smell from all the times he had been on the front during a fight against anima. There was a fight here, and the smell of blood was strong in the air. Stay close. Mark said this as he took a few steps forward. Greg narrowed his eyes, as well as he caught a whiff of the repulsive smell of blood, and he took steps forward behind Mark. Once they moved close enough to see what had happened, Mark clicked his tongue at the sight. There were bodies everywhere. There had obviously been a fight here, and it was obvious that the superhumans were the ones who lost badly. There was blood on the walls, and the ground was littered with body parts and broken people. Mark felt a slippery sensation under his feet, and he frowned when he noticed that he was stepping on someone's liver. Fuck. Check for survivors and see if you can get them out of here. Greg immediately started going from person to see if there was any sign of life in them. Most of the people there were completely torn apart, and there was no chance that they would survive. There was a particular man whose stomach had been torn open, and his hands were missing from the elbow down. Greg felt like retching, but he managed to keep his food in his stomach as he walked past the man and checked the woman beside him who had a lot of blood pooling under her head. Mark took more steps forward, and he looked around him into the darkness. He knew that this might just be a paranoid feeling, but he didn't like this situation at all. A field of dead bodies left behind was an unlikely situation for anima. Anima are known to eat their victims. Mark has fought against multiple anima in his time as Ghost, and he has always known them to eat their victims. So why were all these human bodies here untouched? There were many of the humans that were missing body parts, and some of them were disfigured beyond belief, but there was no sign that any of them were eaten. We aren't alone. Try to keep your guard up. We can't see it, but I think there is an anima in this cave. Once Mark said this, Greg immediately froze as he felt something touch his back. The first thought that came to Greg at that moment was that he was going to die. He cursed himself and his stupidity as he remembered the anima that they just finished fighting against. One of the lizards could disappear, and it was only because of the fire that the female superhuman created that they were able to see the stealthy anima. Greg should have known that there would be more than one of that anima type in this cave. If there was one, then there would surely be more. Greg was crouching down on the ground and examining a corpse when he felt the sensation on his back, and his mind shut down as the only thing that came to the forefront of his mind was to either fight or run like a madman. Fuck it. Greg immediately launched himself forward using his toes, and he managed to get more than 2 meters away from the spot he had been crouching in before he felt something sharp and hard scratch a straight line into his back. Ark! Greg turned around as he felt the pain on his back, and he was stunned to see a single green claw sticking out from thin air and dripping with his blood. He crawled back and tried to get as far away from that thing as possible. He was sure that the rest of its body was being hidden by its camouflage skill. But if its claw was that large, then Greg didn't even want to imagine how big the actual monster was going to be. It must be at least twice the size of the lizard that attacked him in the other tunnel. Screech! The anima screeched as it reached towards Greg, but a hand suddenly grabbed the anima's invisible body, and Mark glared at the invisible creature. Show yourself, motherfucker. Reiju Thunder God. BZZZZTT. Screech. A massive current of electricity passed through the anima's entire body as it was thrown back from where Mark touched it. Mark was reassured once he saw that the skill worked on the anima. That meant that the anima was at least one rank lower than him, and he didn't have to worry too much about being pushed in this fight. The creature stayed on the ground and didn't move a muscle as it spasmed from the electric current, and Mark cracked his knuckles as he started moving towards it. The Reiju Thunder God Constitution gave Mark enhanced physical attributes, but it also allowed him to stun enemies that were weaker than him for 2 seconds. It didn't seem like a long time when it was put on a scale, but when you were fighting with your life on the line, 2 seconds could feel like years. An experienced martial artist could deal life-threatening damage in those 2 seconds, and someone who was sufficiently stronger than you could even end your life. The current that passed through the anima made it lose control of its camouflage ability as it slowly began to reveal its true form. It was a large, grotesque-looking thing with the head and arms of a praying mantis and the body of a centipede. It had multiple legs on its many body layers, but the most dangerous part of its body was the 2 large green arms protruding from its body with large claws at the ends of it. Mark quickly grabbed the anima before the 2 seconds were over, and he dragged its 2 claws forward with both hands. He put his leg on its head, and a brutal sneer appeared on his face as he pulled the claws with intense force until a loud squelch echoed through the cave as they were pulled out from the protruding arms. Screech! Mark noticed that there was a liquid dripping from the ends of the claws, and he quickly assumed that they were poisonous. He made sure he didn't touch that part of the claw as he turned them around and plunged them deep into the anima's body with intense force. The anima screeched in pain as it stumbled back and began to skitter around like a headless lizard. Bang! 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 It slammed its body into the walls of the tunnel constantly as it tried to get the claws out of its body, but there was no way for it to remove the claws, and it eventually succumbed to the liquid and stopped moving. The liquid that it secreted from its claws wasn't poisonous, but they were relaxants that paralyzed the body of anything they were injected into. The anima would use the claws to inject its victims with the relaxant, and then it would wait for its victim to succumb to the relaxant before going in for the kill. Mark was able to figure out that the liquid wasn't poisonous as he came closer to the anima and noticed that it was not yet dead. Its body was paralyzed, but it was still breathing and staring at Mark with wide, terrified eyes. Mark could only chuckle as he placed his feet on the anima's head. What sort of stupid animal isn't immune to its own poison? Aren't you meant to have some sort of fail-safe where you don't get hurt by your own poison? Or were the anima such freaks of nature that they weren't evolved enough to have that fail-safe? Mark knew that the anima were still evolving at a high rate. The anima that could talk from before was already a sign that some of the anima were more advanced than others. This anima couldn't talk, so it was probably less evolved than the other calamity class that Mark fought against. Screech! Screech! The anima screeched feebly in pain as it felt Mark increasing the force that he was using to press down on its head. Mark was leaning forward, and he was making sure to inflict as much pain as possible on the anima as he killed it. The sight of all the people that died here was not going to affect Mark personally. He had already seen too much death and destruction in his time as both king and ghost to be affected by something like this. But that doesn't mean that Mark was heartless. He couldn't just allow the bastard that caused this much death to go scot-free. It had to suffer like they suffered. The souls of the superhumans that risked their lives here wouldn't rest in peace otherwise. Crack! Crack!